The doors to the Grand Tribunal chamber were 30 meters tall and made of crystal that had been grown over 10,000 years on a moon that no longer existed. And when they opened, they made no sound at all, which somehow made them more terrifying than if they had screamed like dying stars. Cadet Alara Vance stood at the threshold and forced herself to breathe. She was 22 years old, and she was about to walk into a room that held representatives from 47 different species. Beings who had traveled between stars when humanity was still figuring out how to make fire. And every single one of them wanted to see her punished. The chamber stretched before her like a canyon carved from light, with tiers of seats rising up and up and up until they disappeared into a ceiling that glowed with the soft radiance of captured nebulae. And in those seats sat creatures of every shape and size imaginable, some with scales, some with feathers, some with bodies made of crystal or gas or something that human eyes could not quite understand. She took her first step forward. Her boots echoed on the floor, despite her best efforts to walk quietly. And she felt every eye in the chamber turn toward her, like weapons locking onto a target. And she kept walking because stopping would mean showing fear. And showing fear in front of the Galactic Concordat was the same as admitting guilt. The walk to the center of the chamber took exactly 47 seconds. She counted each one, and when she finally reached the circular platform where the accused were meant to stand, she stopped and straightened her spine and lifted her chin and waited. Her dress uniform still bore the scorch marks from 3 cycles ago, and she had not cleaned them because she wanted the tribunal to see what she had done. Wanted them to look at the evidence burned into the fabric over her heart and understand that she was not sorry above her. Arranged in a half-circle of elevated seats that seemed to float in the air without any visible support, sat the 7 supreme arbiters who would decide her fate. The highest seat belonged to a Kelvora named Tethrixis, and he was ancient even by the standards of a species that measured lifespans in millennia. With skin like cracked obsidian and eyes that burned with the cold light of stars in their final moments before death. And when he looked down at Alara, she felt like a very small creature standing before a very old mountain that had watched civilizations rise and fall and rise again. Cadet Alara Vance of the United Earth Systems. Tethrixis spoke, and his voice rolled through the chamber like distant thunder. You stand before the Grand Tribunal of the Galactic Concordat to answer for your actions on the world designated Vera 6. Do you understand the gravity of these proceedings? I do, Alara said, and her voice did not shake. And she was proud of that. To her left sat the Verati delegation, and they watched her with eyes full of cold hatred, their scaled faces revealing nothing but contempt for the human who had dared to set foot on their world without permission, who had dared to make decisions that were not hers to make. To her right sat the Erixon High Command, 3 warriors in armor that seemed to absorb light itself, and they had demanded that humanity surrender Alara to their custody for proper military justice, which everyone in the chamber knew was another way of saying execution. And behind her, in the lowest tier of seats reserved for the youngest and least powerful members of the Concordat, sat the human delegation, Ambassador Chun and her 2 aides, silent and still as statues because they had been warned that any intervention on Alara's behalf would cost humanity its seat at this table, would undo 2 centuries of careful diplomacy, would cast their entire species back into the darkness of isolation. Alara was alone. She had known she would be alone from the moment she made her choice on Vera 6. Had known that no one would stand with her. Had known that she would face this chamber and these judges and these accusations with nothing but her own 2 feet to hold her up. And she had made her choice anyway. The charges against you are as follows, another arbiter spoke. A being called Sylventhi, whose body seemed to be made of living water contained within a vaguely humanoid shape. Unauthorized discharge of restricted weaponry in violation of the Concordat arms. Limitation Treaty of Cycle 4721. How do you respond? I did fire the weapon, Alara said. Murmurs rippled through the chamber like waves, spreading across a disturbed pond. Violation of the non-interference doctrine as established in the founding charter of this very Concordat. How do you respond? I did land on Vera 6 without authorization. The murmurs grew louder. Destruction of a sacred Varadi biological preserve containing specimens of irreplaceable scientific and cultural value. How do you respond? I did destroy the preserve. Now the chamber erupted, with voices calling out in languages that Alara's translation implant struggled to process. With the Varadi delegation rising to their feet and pointing at her with clawed fingers and demanding immediate judgment. With the Erixen pounding their armored fists against their seats in a rhythm that sounded like war. Drum's Tethraxis raised one hand, and silence fell instantly, not the gradual silence of voices trailing off, but the immediate and total silence of beings who knew better than to speak when Kelvorn Arbiter commanded quiet. There is one final charge, Tethraxis said, and his burning eyes fixed on Alara with an intensity that made her feel like she was standing in the path of a slow-moving glacier. Insubordination resulting in the deaths of 16 Varadi citizens who remained within the destruction zone at the time of weapons discharge. How do you respond? Alara closed her eyes for just a moment. She saw their faces, the 16 who had been too sick to move, too far gone to save. 16 lives that she had ended with the push of a button, because the alternative was millions more. Because the thing that was killing them would have spread to every world in the sector if she had done nothing. I did kill them, she said. And she opened her eyes and looked directly at Tethraxis. And I knew I was killing them when I made my choice. The Varadi delegation screamed for her blood. The Erixen demanded she be handed over to them immediately. Species she could not name called out in languages she could not understand. But she could hear the anger in their voices, could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. And Ambassador Chun sat in silence, her face a mask of diplomatic neutrality. Because there was nothing she could do, nothing any human could do, not without sacrificing everything their species had worked for since first contact. Alara stood in the center of the storm and waited. She had known this was coming, had prepared herself for it during the long journey to Axis Prime, had told herself that she could endure whatever. They threw at her because she knew with a certainty that went deeper than thought that she had done the right thing, but knowing you did the right thing and standing alone, while an entire galaxy condemned you for it, were two very different experiences. The Tribunal would hear testimony, would examine evidence, would deliberate according to laws that had been written before humanity had left Earth, and then they would render judgment. Alara had no lawyer, no advocate, no one to speak in her defense. She had only the truth, and she had no idea if the truth would be enough to save her. The memory projector hummed to life in the center of the chamber, and suddenly Alara was back on the bridge of the U East Meridian, watching the events of 3 cycles ago unfold like a nightmare she could not wake from. She remembered how ordinary that day had started. The Meridian was a supply vessel, not a warship, crewed by 47 humans who had signed up for what was supposed to be a simple humanitarian mission to deliver medical supplies to a Varadi colony that was suffering from a crop blight. Shake some hands, take some photos for the diplomatic corps, and go home. Alara had been a junior logistics officer, which meant she spent most of her time counting crates and making sure the right supplies went to the right places, and she had been good at her job. Had taken pride in the small ways she helped keep the mission running smoothly. She had never expected to become a killer. The projection showed the Meridian dropping out of faster-than-light travel above Vera 6, a green and blue world that looked so much like Earth that it made Alara's heart ache. And she remembered pressing her face against the viewport and thinking how beautiful it was. Captain Morrison's voice echoed through the memory. All hands. We are receiving a priority transmission from the colony. Stand by for updated mission parameters. That was the moment everything changed. The colony's governor appeared on the main screen. A Varadi female with scales the color of autumn leaves and eyes wide with barely controlled terror. And she spoke words that did not match the official briefing the Meridian had received. The blight is not natural, the governor said, her voice trembling. It is something else. Something that escaped from a facility that was never supposed to exist. And it is not just killing our crops anymore. It is killing us. Alara watched her younger self freeze at her station. Watched the color drain from Captain Morrison's face. Watched the bridge crew exchange looks of growing horror as the governor continued speaking. We call it the hollow because that is what it does. It hollows things out from the inside. Plants first, then animals, then people. It gets inside you, and it eats everything that makes you alive while your body keeps moving. Keeps walking, keeps screaming. The projection shifted to show sensor data. Biological readings that made the Tribunal's medical experts lean forward in there. Seats with expressions of academic interest that Alara found. Obscene, how could they look at those readings and see anything other than suffering? The hollow was a parasitic organism, engineered in a Varadi weapons laboratory as a potential tool of war. And it had been designed to spread fast, to adapt faster, to consume everything organic in its path and convert it into more of itself. And it had escaped 11,000 Varadi lived in the colony. And by the time the Meridian arrived, 800 of them were already dead, with hundreds more showing early symptoms, the glassy eyes, the trembling hands, the way their scales began to lose their color, as the hollow ate them from within. Captain Morrison did exactly what protocol demanded. She opened a secure channel to Concordat Command and requested emergency guidance. And while she waited for a response, she ordered the Meridian into a high orbit where the crew could observe but not interfere. The response came 6 hours later. Quarantine protocols are in effect, the Concordat representative said. A bureaucrat whose species Alara did not recognize. The Varadi government has been notified and has declined outside assistance. The non-interference doctrine is clear. You are to observe and document but take no direct action. This directive comes from the highest levels of Concordat authority. Alara remembered the silence on the bridge after that transmission ended. She remembered Lieutenant Park asking if there was some kind of mistake. Remembered Ensign Williams suggesting they must have misunderstood. Remembered Captain Morrison standing very still, with her hands clasped behind, her back and her jaw clenched so tight that Alara could see the muscles jumping beneath her skin. The Varadi government has declined assistance, Morrison said finally, and every word seemed to cost her something precious. We will comply with Concordat directives, maintain observation. All hands are restricted to the ship until further notice. So they watched. The projection showed day after day of sensor feeds and intercepted communications and distress calls that nobody was allowed to answer. A concert, mother begging someone, anyone, to save her children. A doctor reporting that the hollow had mutated and was now spreading through the air. A group of survivors barricading themselves in a warehouse and slowly starving because they were too afraid to go outside. Alara had learned their names. She had access to colonies, public records, and found their faces. Had read about their lives and their families and their dreams. Had made herself witness to their suffering because looking away felt like a betrayal. Kethvari was a teacher who had spent 30 years helping young Varadi understand mathematics. And she died on the 4th day when the hollow finally broke through the walls of the school where she had been sheltering. With her student Sant was a farmer who had refused to abandon. his crops even as the blight turned them black and rotten. And he died on the 5th day, still trying to save seeds for next year's planting. Little Vatha was 7 years old, and she had been afraid of the dark. And she died on the 6th day, holding the hand of a mother who was already gone. Alara remembered every single one of them. The projection showed her younger self sitting alone in her quarters, staring at a screen full of faces, and she remembered the way her hands had trembled. Remembered the hot tears running down her cheeks. Remembered the terrible certainty growing in her chest that if someone did not do something soon, everyone in that colony would die. And then the ship's chief science officer made an announcement that changed everything. "Captain, we have analyzed the latest mutation data," Lieutenant Commander Reyes said, her voice carefully controlled in a way that meant she was trying very hard not to panic. "The Hollow has developed an airborne variant. Current wind patterns suggest it will spread beyond the quarantine zone within the next 72 hours. 72 hours in 72 hours. The Hollow would escape into the atmosphere, would be carried by winds to other settlements, would eventually reach the spaceports where ships came and went to 100 different worlds. The entire sector would fall." Morrison sent another urgent request to Concordat. "Command and receive the same answer. Observe and document, but do not interfere. The Varadi government insists on handling this matter internally. Any unauthorized action will be considered a violation of treaty and punished accordingly." That night, Alara made her decision. She did not sleep, did not eat, did not do anything except sit in her quarters and think about what she was about to do, about the laws she was about to break, about the price she would have to pay. The Meridian carried a Class 7 purifier charge in its emergency stores, a weapon designed for use against biological contamination, capable of incinerating everything organic within a 5-kilometer radius, so dangerous that its use required authorization from at least 3 different governmental bodies under normal circumstances. Normal circumstances had ended the moment the Hollow started. Spreading Alara knew the codes to the weapons locker, because she was a logistics officer and it was her job to know where everything was stored. And she knew how to pilot a shuttle because every officer on the Meridian was required to maintain basic flight certification. And she knew that if she did this thing, she would never be able to take it back. She thought about the 16 colonists still alive in the infection zone, too sick to move, too far gone to save, but still breathing, still technically alive. She thought about what would happen to them if she did nothing. She thought about what would happen to everyone else if she did nothing, and then she got up and walked to the shuttle bay. The projection ended there, freezing on the image of Alara Vance opening the shuttle door, her face pale but determined, her eyes fixed on something beyond the camera's view in the Tribunal chamber. 47 species sat in silence, and Alara stood in the center of it all, waiting for what would come next. She had made her choice. Now she would have to live with the consequences. The testimony had gone on for 3 days. Witness after witness had come forward to describe what Alara had done. The Meridian security chief explaining how she had bypassed the lockouts on the weapons locker. A Varadi scientist describing the devastation she had left behind. An Erixan military analyst calculating the exact yield of the purifier charge and the precise radius of its destruction. Every word was another stone placed on the scale of her judgment. And Alara could feel the weight growing heavier with each passing hour. Now the chamber had grown quiet, and Supreme Arbiter Tethraxis leaned forward in his floating seat, his ancient eyes fixed on the small human standing alone in the center of the floor. "The evidence has been presented," he said, and his voice filled the chamber like smoke filling a room. "The facts are not in dispute. Cadet Vance has admitted to every action attributed to her. She took a weapon that was forbidden. She descended to a world where she had no authority. She detonated that weapon and destroyed everything within its radius. He paused. And in that pause, Alara could hear the breathing of beings from 100 different worlds. Could feel their attention pressing against her like a physical weight. 16 Verati citizens died in that explosion. Tethraxis continued. 16 beings who were still alive when Cadet Vance made her choice. 16 lives ended by human hands. The Verati delegation stirred, and their leader rose to speak, Ambassador Kethful, whose scales were the deep purple of royalty, and whose voice carried the cold precision of someone who had spent decades learning how to use words as weapons. The Concordat has laws for a reason. Kethful said, the non-interference doctrine exists because species cannot be trusted to make decisions for one another. Because what one civilization sees as mercy, another might see as murder. Because the galaxy learned long ago that good intentions are the shortest path to war. He pointed at Alara, and his claw was steady, unwavering. This human decided that she knew better than our government, better than our scientists, better than our people what was right for our world. She did not ask permission. She did not seek guidance. She simply acted, and 16 of my people paid the price for her arrogance. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. The Erixen demand justice. The leader of their delegation spoke next, rising from his seat in a motion that made his armor click and shift like the plates of some great predatory beast. This human has violated treaties that have kept peace in this galaxy for 9,000 years. If she is not punished, if she is allowed to walk free, then those treaties mean nothing. Then any species with sufficient weapons can impose their will on any other. Then we return to the chaos of the before times when worlds burned and civilizations fell. More murmurs. Louder now, Alara stood in the center of it all and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Because everything they were accusing her of was true. She had broken their laws, she had violated their treaties. She had killed those 16 Verati colonists as surely as if she had held a weapon to their heads. But she had also saved millions. That was the part they did not want to talk about. The hollow had been contained, incinerated along with everything else in the blast radius. And the sector had been spared a plague that would have spread from world to world until nothing remained but empty cities and hollow-eyed corpses walking through the ruins of civilizations. The Concordat's own scientists had confirmed it. If Alara had waited even one more day, the airborne variant would have escaped containment, and nothing could have stopped it then. But the law did not care about what might have happened. The law only cared about what did happen. And what happened was that a human cadet had broken protocol and killed people. And now the tribunal had to decide what to do about it. Tethraxis raised his hand for silence. And silence fell. We have heard the evidence, he said. We have heard the testimony. We have heard the arguments of those who seek justice and those who demand punishment. Now there is only one thing left. He fixed his burning gaze on Alara, and she felt the weight of 9,000 years of galactic law pressing down on her shoulders. The tribunal has one question for the accused. Alara braced herself. She knew what was coming. Her legal counsel, such as it was, had warned her about this moment, had explained that the tribunal always ended with a question. A single query designed to determine whether the accused understood the gravity of their actions. Answer carefully, the council had warned. Your fate depends on it. But Alara had known even then that there was no good answer. No magic words that would make the tribunal see things her way. No argument that would convince 47 species that a 22-year-old human had been right to do what governments and admirals and ancient laws had said she must not do. Tethraxis spoke, and his words echoed through the chamber like the tolling of a great bell. Cadet Alara Vance of the United Earth Systems, by what authority did you act? There it was, the trap, laid bare before her under Concordat law. Only certain entities had the authority to order the kind of action she had taken. a commanding officer, could give the order. A recognized governmental body could grant permission. The tribunal itself could authorize intervention in extreme circumstances. Alara had none of these. Her commanding officer had explicitly ordered the crew to observe and not interfere. The Varadi government had refused all outside assistance, and the tribunal had not been consulted at all. She had acted alone, without permission, without authority, without any legal justification whatsoever if she answered. Honestly, if she admitted that she had no authority, she would be confirming her guilt beyond any possibility of appeal. Her counsel had suggested an alternative, claimed psychological compromise. He had whispered during their last meeting. Tell them that the stress of watching the colony die affected your judgment, that you were not in your right mind when you made the decision. The tribunal has shown mercy to those who plead temporary incapacity before. Here's your best chance. But that would be a lie. Alara had been in her right mind when she made her choice, had weighed the options with perfect clarity, had understood exactly what she was doing, and why she was doing it. She had not acted out of madness or desperation or confusion. She had acted because it was right. The chamber waited for her answer. Varadi waited to hear her condemn herself. The Erikson waited to claim their prize, and somewhere in the back, Ambassador Chun sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of diplomatic neutrality that could not quite hide the sorrow in her eyes. Alara took a breath. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, could feel the weight of the moment settling around her like a shroud, could feel the future branching before her into paths that led to exile or imprisonment or death. And she made her choice, not the choice her counsel had recommended, not the choice that might have saved her, but the choice that felt true. She would not beg for mercy. She would not pretend to be something she was not. She would not dishonor the memory of those she had saved and those she had killed by lying about. Why she had done it, the chamber waited, and Alara opened her mouth to answer. The chamber waited for Alara to answer the Supreme Arbiter's question, and she was supposed to face him when she spoke, was supposed to address her words to the 7 judges who floated above her like gods, deciding the fate of a mortal who had dared to reach beyond her station. Instead, she turned her back on them. Gasps erupted from a dozen different species, sounds of shock and outrage that rippled through the chamber like shock waves from an explosion. Because what she had just done was more than rude. It was an insult to the very foundation of Concordat law. No one turned their back on the tribunal. No one, Cadet Vance, Tethraxis said. And there was something dangerous in his voice now. Something old and cold and utterly without mercy. You will face this tribunal when you speak. No, Alara said, and she kept her back to him, kept her eyes on the assembled species, who filled the tiers of seats rising up around her like the walls of an arena. I will not. The chamber exploded. The Varadi delegation screamed for her to be held in contempt. The Erikson rose to their feet, with hands reaching for weapons that protocol required them to leave at the door. And somewhere in the chaos, Ambassador Chun closed her eyes and bowed her head like someone watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. But Alara did not move. She stood in the center of the storm and waited. And something in the way she waited, the stillness of her body, the set of her shoulders, the quiet certainty radiating from her like heat from a star, made the chamber slowly, reluctantly fall silent. You asked me a question, Alara said, when the noise had died down enough for her voice to carry. You asked by what authority I acted, and I will answer. But first, she turned in a slow circle, making eye contact with delegation after delegation, species after species, letting them see her face, letting them see that she was not afraid. First, I want to ask this tribunal a question. More gasps, more outrage. More voices calling for her to be silenced and punished and removed from the chamber. The accused did not ask questions. The accused answered them. But Tethraxis raised his hand for silence, and when he spoke, there was something new in his voice. Not anger, not contempt, but something that might have been curiosity. Speak. Then, he said, ask you a question, human. Alara nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that was not quite a bow. And then she pointed at the Varadi delegation. Where were you? Ambassador Kefval's scales flushed darker with confusion or anger. It was hard to tell with. Varadi, I do not understand the question, he said. Yes, you do, Alara replied, and her voice was steady. Calm, as cold as space itself. 11,000 of your people were dying on Vareth 6. Dying from a plague that your own government created in a weapons laboratory that was never supposed to exist. And you knew what was happening. You knew your people were screaming for help. And you did nothing. The chamber went very, very quiet. You let them die, Alara continued. Not because you could not save them, but because saving them would mean admitting that the laboratory existed, would mean admitting that your government had been developing biological weapons in violation of 14 different treaties, would mean facing consequences that you were not willing to accept. Kefval opened his mouth to respond, but Alara was already turning, already pointing at the Erixon delegation. And where were you? The Erixon commander's armor seemed to grow darker, seemed to absorb even more light as he glared at her with eyes like chips of obsidian. We were not involved in this matter, he growled. You had 3 warships in the sector, Alara said. 3 ships with weapons powerful enough to sterilize an entire continent. And your sensors picked up the same data that ours did. You knew what the hollow was. You knew it was about to spread, and you did nothing. She turned again, spreading her arms wide to encompass the entire chamber. 47 species, she said, and her voice rose now. Carrying to the highest tiers were beings she could not even name sat watching in their crystalline seats. 47 civilizations with fleets and armies and technology that humanity cannot even begin to understand. And when 11,000 people were dying, when millions more were about to die, you did nothing. She let her arms fall to her sides. You sat in your ships and your stations and your comfortable offices. And you followed protocol, and you watched. The silence that followed was absolute. So yes, Alara said. And now she did turn to face Tethraxis, did meet those burning ancient eyes with her own very human, very young, very certain gaze. I will answer your question. I will tell you by what authority I acted. She took a step forward, toward the floating seats where the arbiters waited. I had no authority. Another step. I had no rank, no mandate, no permission from any government or military body or legal institution recognized by this concordat. Another step. I was a junior officer on a supply ship, a logistics specialist who was very good at counting crates and making sure things ended up where they were supposed to go. She stopped, standing as close to the arbiters as the chamber's protocols would allow. But I had something that all of you, with all your fleets and all your laws and all your 9,000 years of civilization, seem to have forgotten. She pressed her hand to her chest, over her heart, over the scorch marks that were still burned into her uniform on Earth. We have a word. I am told it does not translate well in the most concordat languages. And maybe that is because the thing it describes is something that other species do not feel the way we do. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft, but somehow it carried to every corner of the chamber. We call it conscience. It is the voice inside you that speaks when no one else is watching. The part of you that knows what is right, even when the law says otherwise. It is the thing that makes a human being look at a child who is suffering and feel their pain as if it were our own. She looked at the Varadi delegation. It is the thing that makes it impossible to stand by while innocent people die, even if helping them means breaking every rule you have ever been taught. She looked at the Erixon. It is the thing that says some laws are written not in treaties or constitutions, but in the very nature of what it means to be alive. To be aware, to be capable of making choices. She turned back to Tethraxis. You asked by what authority I acted. And here is my answer. I acted on the authority of being someone who gave a damn. The words hung in the air like a challenge. I looked at those people dying, and I could not look away. I heard them screaming, and I could not cover my ears. I knew that I had the power to help them, and I could not do nothing. Her voice cracked slightly. The first sign of emotion she had shown since the tribunal began, so I acted. I broke your laws and I violated your treaties, and I killed 16 people who were already dying to save millions who still had a chance. And I knew what it would cost me. I knew I would end up here, standing before you, facing judgment for the crime of caring too much. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin. And if I had to do it again, if I was back on that ship, watching those people die, knowing what I know now, I would make the same choice. The chamber erupted once more. But this time, there was something different in the sound. Something that was not quite anger, not quite outrage. Something that might have been uncertainty. And in the floating seats above, Tethraxis leaned back and looked at Alara with those ancient, burning eyes. And for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, something in his expression shifted. Something that might have been recognition, or something that might have been respect. The chaos in the chamber went on for nearly an hour. Delegations shouted at each other. At the arbiters, at Alara herself, some demanding her immediate execution. Others calling for calm. A few sitting in stunned silence, as if they had just witnessed something they did not quite understand. But eventually, as all storms do, the chaos subsided. Tethraxis raised his hand one final time, and the chamber fell quiet, and Alara stood in the center of the floor and waited for the judgment that would determine the rest of her life. This tribunal will deliberate, the ancient Kelvoran said, and his voice was different now, heavier somehow, as if he was carrying a weight he had not expected to bear. The accused will be escorted to a holding area until we have reached our decision. Guards came for Alara Concordat security officers in armor that shimmered with energy fields. Members of a species she did not recognize, with faces that showed no emotion. Hands that were firm but not cruel as they guided her out of the chamber. She did not resist. She had said what she needed to say, had done what she needed to do. And now all she could do was wait. The holding area was a small room with white walls and a single bench. And Alara sat there for 6 hours while the tribunal debated her fate. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the blank wall in front of her. And she thought about the 16 people she had killed. She had memorized their names too. Kethval the Elder, who had been a poet before the sickness took his mind. Sylveth the Young, who had just celebrated her first decade of life. Ornke the Healer, who had stayed behind to care for the others when he could have fled. 16 names, 16 faces, 16 lives that had ended. Because Alara Vance had decided that millions mattered more than dozens. She would carry those names with her for the rest of her life, whatever that life turned out to be. When the guards finally came for her again, their faces were still unreadable, and they said nothing as they escorted her back through the corridors of Axis Prime, back through the towering crystal doors, back into the Grand Tribunal chamber, where 47 species waited to hear what the arbiters had decided. The chamber was quieter than before. Something had changed in the atmosphere. Some subtle shift in the way the delegations held themselves. Some tension that had been present earlier, now replaced by something else. Alara could not quite identify what it was. She took her place in the center of the floor and waited. Tethraxis leaned forward in his floating seat, and his burning eyes met hers, and for a long moment neither of them looked away. This tribunal has deliberated, he said, and his voice filled the chamber with the weight of 9,000 years of galactic law. We have examined the evidence. We have considered the testimony. We have weighed the arguments of those who demand punishment and those who plead for mercy. He paused, and we have reached a conclusion that has no precedent in the history of this institution. Murmurs stirred through the chamber like wind through grass. The actions of Cadet Alara Vance were illegal. Tethraxis said, "This is not in dispute." She violated the non-interference doctrine. She discharged a restricted weapon without authorization. She took lives that were not hers to take under the laws of this Concordat. She is guilty. Alara's heart clenched. But she kept her face neutral, kept her spine straight, kept her eyes on the ancient being who held her fate in his hands. However, that single word seemed to hang in the air like a held breath. This tribunal was established 9,000 years ago to ensure peace between species, to prevent the wars and genocides that had nearly destroyed our civilizations, to create a framework of law that would allow beings of different natures to coexist without conflict. Tethraxis looked out at the assembled delegations, but laws are not ends in themselves. They are means to an end, and the end was always the same. The end was always the protection of life. He turned his gaze back to Alara. When Cadet Vance acted, she violated our laws, but she upheld their purpose. She broke our treaties, but she honored their intent. She defied the authority of this Concordat, but she served the very ideals that Concordat was created to preserve. The chamber was absolutely silent now. The tribunal therefore renders the following judgment, a moral paradox ruling. Gasps erupted from several delegations. The actions of Cadet Alara Vance were illegal, and she will face consequences for her violation of Concordat law. She will be discharged from the United Earth System's military. She will be barred from holding any rank or position of authority in any military organization recognized by this Concordat. She will carry this judgment on her record for the rest of her life. Tethraxis paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was somehow gentler, but her actions were also just. And this tribunal refuses to condemn justice, refuses to punish a being whose only crime was caring too much about the lives of others, refuses to make an example of someone who did what all of us, with all our fleets and all our power, were too afraid or too bound by protocol to do. He rose from his seat, and his ancient body unfolded like a mountain standing up. Cadet Vance, you are free to go. The chamber exploded, but not with anger this time. The Verata delegation sat in stunned silence, their demands for blood dying on their lips. The Erixans stood frozen, their warrior's honor suddenly uncertain in the face of a judgment they had not anticipated, and from other delegations, from species that Alara had never spoken to, never even learned the names of. Something extraordinary happened. They rose to their feet, one delegation, then another, then a dozen more, standing up in their seats as Alara walked toward the exit. A Kelvaran word began to spread through the chamber, passed from voice to voice in a rolling wave of sound. A word that Alara's translation implant struggled to process because it had no direct equivalent in human language, roughly, imperfectly. It meant something like one who runs toward the fire. It meant someone who sees danger and moves toward it instead of away. It meant someone who faces the flames to save others. Even knowing they might be burned, Alara walked through the chamber with her head held high, and as she passed the human delegation, Ambassador Chun reached out and caught her hand. "You did something today," the ambassador whispered, and there were tears in her eyes. "You changed something. I do not know what it will mean for our people, but you changed something." Alara squeezed her hand once, then let go, then kept walking. The crystal doors opened before her, and she stepped through them into the corridor beyond, and behind her the word kept spreading, kept being spoken by voices that had never spoken it for a human before, one who runs toward the fire on the journey home. Alara sat in her cabin on the transport ship and looked out at the stars. And she thought about what she had done and what it had cost and what it might mean. She was no longer a soldier. She would never hold rank again, never command a ship, never wear the uniform that had once made her so proud. But she had saved millions of lives, and she had given the galaxy something to think about, a reminder that laws were supposed to serve the living, not the other way around. When she finally returned to Earth, she did not go back to the military academies or the government offices or any of the places where her story might have made her famous. Instead, she took a job at a small university in a city that most people had never heard of, teaching ethics to students who were just beginning to figure out what they believed in. And sometimes, late at night when the campus was quiet and the stars were visible through her office window, she would think about the 16 names she still carried, the 16 people she had killed to save millions more. She did not regret her choice. She never would. But she honored their memory by teaching the next generation that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules, that sometimes courage meant standing alone against the judgment of the entire world, that sometimes the most important authority was the voice inside your own heart. Humanity's reputation in the Concordat changed after that day. They were still young, still reckless, still dangerously emotional by the standards of species that had been traveling between stars for millennia. But now the galaxy understood something else about them. When the law said to look away, humans looked closer. When protocol said to do nothing, humans moved. And when the fire came for the helpless, humans ran toward it, even if they had to burn. That was what it meant to have a conscience. That was what it meant to be human.